Good afternoon. My name is Bonnie Berdelay, and I'm a member of the Graduate School Alumni Association Council. I'm very happy to be here today to introduce Dr. Alexandra Vacroux. Dr. Vacroux is the executive director, of the Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies at Harvard University. Her scholarly work addresses Russian and Eurasian policy issues, including the war in Ukraine. As Director of Graduate Studies for the Davis Center's MA program in Regional Studies, she has mentored dozens of Harvard's best and brightest students and regional experts. She also directs the center's Scholars Without Borders program. Alexandra lived in Moscow from 1992 to 2004. While there, she was a consultant for the Russian Privatization Agency, partner and head of sales at the Brunswick Wurzburg Investment Bank, and an active member of the board of United Way Moscow. While completing her dissertation on corruption in Russian pharmaceutical markets, she was affiliated with the Center for Economic and Financial Research, a Russian think tank associated with the New Economics School. Prior to joining the Davis Center in 2010, she lived in Washington, D.C., where she was a scholar with the Kennan Institute, part of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Vacroux.
Thank you so much. I tend to prance around, so I'm going to be moving here, and I have a mic, but I think everybody can hear me, correct? Okay, great. So today I want to talk about the war in Ukraine. We've all read a lot about it. It's almost inescapable, or at least it was until October 6th. But I think that one of the problems in what you read in the newspaper is that you don't always see the bigger context, why the war started, why the Russians are so intent on seeing it go as far as it can, and what the impact has been on Ukraine and the broader world's economy and world political system. So I'm going to try and cover all of those things, but I'm going to do a slideshow first, about 30 minutes or so, maybe a little bit longer, and then I would love to answer questions, because that's really the way that we figure out what it is that people are most interested in. So let's start out with just a very quick overview of how the war began. In February 2022, Russia tried to invade Ukraine from three sides, from the north, coming in from the east, and also from the south through Crimea, which had been annexed in 2014. So in many ways, we think of the war now as being 2 years old, but for Ukrainians, they think of it as being 10 years old. They mark the beginning of the conflict as coming when Russia annexed Crimea down here in 2014 and started supporting separatists in Donetsk and Luhansk, what we call the Donbass region, in 2014. The war was going quite actively, quite persistently along that line of contact, especially here, for 8 years before the full-scale invasion of 2022. And one of the questions that we've been asking ourselves is, why did Russia think it would be able to take over a country of 44 million people with 200,000 troops? That's the number of troops that were amassed along the border between Russia and Ukraine in January and February of 2022. And pictures of those troops are what the American community, the American intelligence community, was circulating to Europeans to convince them that Russia was potentially ready to mount a large-scale invasion. One of the reasons they weren't believed is because people said that the troop-to-task ratio is completely wrong. You can't take a country of 44 million with 200,000 troops. The reason that we think Russia thought this was possible was because they used their experience in Crimea, which was much more Russian-speaking and which had a huge military base on it, and they kind of assumed it was going to be a cakewalk. Some of the soldiers that were in that 40-mile convoy that was stuck on the way to Kiev had parade dress in their kits, right? They really thought they were going to be met like liberators in Kiev. That was obviously not the case. The Ukrainians mounted an incredible resistance and pushed the Russians back out north into Belarus and then out of Kharkiv and Kherson in the fall of 2022. So this is basically where the conflict has been focused now from since the fall of 2022. There have been counteroffensive and skirmishes along this border. And one of the problems with looking at this kind of map, which is so far out, is that you can't really tell what the conflict is like. So if we go a little closer, right, you can see that the very intense conflict that we've been hearing about, the Bakhmuts, the Avdiivkas, the struggle for towns, are happening in very localized area. The Institute for the Study of War does regular maps every day, and what they find sometimes is that we're talking about a movement of 300 meters a day from one side or the other, right? It's really very small territorial gains, mostly right now in the Russians' favor, but even before, when it was in the Ukrainians' favor, it's very aggressive fighting in very small territories, trying to push the line forward. But even looking at this map doesn't really tell you what's happening on the ground. What's happening on the ground, particularly in cities, so this is Bakhmut, is that the Russians are basically destroying everything in their path. Here is an image at the top there from May 2022 from Bakhmut. You can see there's a school, that's that H-shaped building in the upper right quadrant. And this is what that school looks like a year later in May 2023. And one of the reasons that this is the case is that the Russians are not good at urban warfare. In fact, in the military journals that were being published before the war in 2021 and 2022, there were articles that were talking about how they had never really trained to fight in cities. Their soldiers didn't have the equipment, they didn't have the training, and they didn't have the techniques that it would take to go door to door, clear buildings, and leave those buildings standing. So the strategy that the Russians are using is essentially what they used in Grozny in Chechnya in the 1990s, and then in Aleppo in Syria, and now in Bakhmut. One of the things that's very important to remember is that while the Russians have managed to dig in and are fighting along this line of contact, Ukraine is a very urbanized country. About 75% of the population live in cities. And apart from Mariupol, the Russians have not managed to take a single large city. So one of the things that you hear people saying is, oh, you know, this looks so hopeless. The Ukrainians can't defend themselves. The Russians are inexorably advancing. And the fact is that the Russians have not been able to take cities. So while this is what it looks like at the drone perspective, on the ground, it looks like this. And I know the lighting is not great, but basically it's trench warfare. The soldiers, both on the Ukrainian side and the Russian side, are living in conditions that are not all that different from World War I. They now often have small drones that they're launching to see what's on the other side. And in fact, that is the important difference, which is there is what the military analysts call complete transparency on the battlefield. You're hiding in your trench, but the Russians can send a drone over and see you in that trench. And same with the Ukrainians to the Russians. And that means that if you look at how manpower is dispersed in this conflict, you never have large groupings of troops, because once you do that, the other side is going to strike them. So you have very small mobile units basically running from trench to trench or from a stand of trees to another stand to try and evade the fact that there are so many drones and that it's impossible to hide. One of the other interesting features is that there is an asymmetry between the Ukrainians' ability to use satellite information or satellite intelligence, which they're getting from the Europeans and the Americans, and the fact that the Russians don't really have that kind of access to good high-resolution satellite pictures. So whereas the Ukrainians are good on satellite intel, the Russians are good on electronic warfare, which basically means jamming the signals that are being sent. Right? So the Ukrainians see the battlefield better, they send more drones, but those drones are then jammed as they approach the Russian positions and fall someplace short of their targets. So this is what it looks like on the battlefield. But there are a lot of places that are not the battlefield that are also being hit. This is aerial strikes, drones and missiles in a 4-hour period in October of last year. It was released by the Ukrainian General Command. And what you can see is that there are a lot of places in Ukraine that are vulnerable. Maybe it's just one missile strike a day or a week, but it's enough to keep the population in that state of tension that nowhere is really completely safe. And while we focus on this area that is occupied by the Russians, it's important to remember that it's still very much all of Ukraine that is at war and all of Ukraine that is being struck. This was a maternity hospital that was struck in 2022. And it's emblematic of the fact that the Russians are striking civilian infrastructure quite extensively. So you might have read, for example, in the past couple months, the Russians have intensified strikes against energy infrastructure, which is one of the reasons why the Ukrainians, in turn, have started using drones to strike in Russia some of the energy infrastructure there, for example, the oil refineries. But the situation on the ground here, while important, also doesn't capture the whole picture. What it doesn't capture is the refugees that have had to either move across Ukraine because their homes have been struck, or that have moved abroad. And this is particularly women and children. So by some estimates, 30% of Ukrainian women are now abroad. 30%. The country had 51 million people when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. When the war started, it had 44 million people, so already a significant demographic decline. And now it's hard to tell, but the estimates is that there are probably 33, 34 million people in Ukraine. So 8 to 10 million people have left because of the war. And importantly, most of those are women and children, right? So men between the ages of 18 and 60 are not allowed to leave Ukraine. So when we look at an age-sex pyramid, here you have women on the right and men on the left in 5-year bands, right? So 0 to age 4 or 5. You see that the gray part is the population that has left. And you can see as soon as you have boys under 18, you have 30 to 40% of those boys have left the country. And when it comes to the women and the girls, it's an enormous number of people that have left. Now, the reason that that's particularly important is because Ukraine is actively thinking about what happens when the war ends. How are you going to get these people to come home? On the one hand, they've left their husbands or their fathers or their brothers in Ukraine, so they have an incentive to go back. On the other hand, they would probably much rather that that man come and join them wherever it is that they've set themselves up, particularly if their kids are now in a good German lyceum, learning German, on track to be at a German university. It's going to be a very hard play to try and get Ukrainians to come home. So why did Russia invade Ukraine, after all? There are 5 reasons, 5 theories, if you will, that have been put forward to explain it. And let me just say, before we go through them, we don't know the answer to this question, right? Because it depends on knowing what Putin was thinking. In an autocratic system, it's the person at the top who's making decisions. And in the case of Russia, it's a particularly opaque system. So we have guesses, but we're not able to confirm which theory is accurate. And in fact, even if we interviewed Putin and asked him, we wouldn't necessarily know the answer. We would only know what he wanted us to believe. So the first argument, which is the one that has been put forward by the realist school of thought, if you might have heard of John Mearsheimer at the University of Chicago, and the realists believe, like Kissinger was the famous realist, that great powers are always concerned about their security. They essentially take all of their decisions in a way to maximize their security, and they're threatened whenever they feel like they are going to increase their vulnerability to attack from outside. Now, in Russia, this is a sensitive subject, it's true. Russia has long seen itself, since the days of the Russian Empire, as surrounded by enemies and needing a circle of buffer countries. And if we think of what the Soviet Union had set up, where it had Russia as the core of the Soviet Union, and then 14 republics around it, Caucasus and Central Asia and the Baltics, and then it had the Warsaw Pact around that between it and NATO, there was quite a big buffer zone to protect it. And slowly but surely, after 1991, most of those Warsaw Pact countries have joined NATO. Not because they were forced to, right? Not because NATO demanded it, but because they wanted protection from Russia. And now, when you talk to Russians, or when you hear and see what Russians are writing, they're saying, we were taken advantage of. Gorbachev was a rube. NATO was much more clever. They convinced him that this was going to be fine. That's why he allowed German reunification. But we were never going to accept this NATO expansion closer and closer to our borders. And we certainly were not going to accept Ukraine or Georgia coming into NATO. And for most of the 1990s and the 2000s, the West just kind of shrugged and said, look, Russia may not like it that much. They weren't complaining about it all that much either. In fact, Putin suggested that maybe Russia should join NATO. But since 2007, then 2014, this has become a more and more important part of the discourse, to the point where now this argument that NATO is going to be setting up bases in Ukraine and then launching attacks on Russia is almost taken as common knowledge. However, if Russia was all that concerned about NATO and convinced that a border attack was imminent, it's highly unlikely that when Finland joined, increasing the border between NATO and Russia by 800 miles, that Russia would actually pull its troops away from the north and send them to Ukraine, which is what has happened. So on some level, I think that this is a spurious argument. It's made because it gets people worried that maybe it's our fault that Russia invaded Ukraine and not Russia's decision to invade Ukraine. But there's enough evidence to suggest that it's a convenient and possibly contributing factor, but certainly not the only reason. The second reason comes as kind of a rebuke to the realists, and the argument for legitimation is a country's foreign policy reflects domestic politics and domestic concerns of the leader. So Vladimir Putin, now in power for 24 years, has found it at times difficult to sustain his approval ratings of 80%. 80%, let's put it in quotes. And when they last dipped before 2014, they were around 60%, right? And the trends are important here, not the absolute numbers. They annexed Crimea, and there was a big rally around the flag effect, and his popularity popped back up to 80%. Now, you might say, why does a dictator need to be popular? Like, he can just run the country anyway. And the fact is, it's a lot easier to be a popular dictator than an unpopular dictator. And so if you can get an approval rating, and if you can get 87% in the last presidential election, like Putin, you're happy, right? Because it's much harder for any opponents to say, you don't have popular legitimacy, you don't have popular support. So it is possible that, thinking back at how successful the annexation of Crimea was, that Putin thought that taking some more of Ukraine was also going to increase his popularity, the rally around the flag effect. The third argument that was made, and it was made very strongly in Putin's speeches when the invasion began, is that Russia had an obligation to protect Russians, right? And by Russians here, what they mean are Russian speakers. So it's as if we decided that we should invade Canada to protect the English speakers, right? Because that's probably what they want, to be protected from those nasty French speakers who want to violate the English speakers' rights. So it was part of this concept that Putin has been promoting since the mid-2000s of Ruski Mir, right? Or the Russian world. Because Russia also has a demographic problem and is also keen to find ways to increase the size of its population and its influence, it finds that being restricted to the 140 million Russians is really a little bit claustrophobic. So Russia has decided that it is also responsible for protecting the rights, as perceived by Moscow, of Russian speakers wherever they may be. And to confirm that these people want to have Russian support, what Russia does in occupied territories, like eastern Ukraine, the Donbass, like Abkhazia and South Ossetia in Georgia, like Transnistria in Moldova, is they pass out Russian passports. And Russian passports come not only with the right to travel easily to Russia, but also with access to Russian pensions, which are much higher than what you would get if you were living in these countries with a national passport. You can also get different Russian benefits, welfare benefits. And so they're basically buying more citizens and passing out these passports, and then they can claim that they're protecting Russian citizens because, after all, those people have passports. And this is a technique that's continued, by the way, in the occupied territories. There are reports, and it's very difficult to know exactly what's going on there, but there are reports that in order to get medical care, like to go to the polyclinic, if you're in one of the occupied territories, you have to show a Russian passport. And if you don't show a Russian passport, you can't go see the doctor. Right? So that's another incentive to get your Russian passport, if only to be able to see the doctor. Another argument that was made very strongly at the beginning of the war was that Russia had to denazify Ukraine, right? So this This goes back to the trope from World War II that Ukraine, particularly Western Ukraine, is filled with Nazis that are actually controlling Zelensky, a Jew, and threaten Russia and the integrity of Russia. Once again, Russia needs to fight fascism, as it did in the Great Patriotic War, which is what they call World War II. It's to the point where the soldiers that were arriving in those territories in the early days of 2022 were coming to a village, and they would go, to a grandmother and say, "Grandmother, grandmother, where are the Nazis?" She's like, "There are no Nazis here." It remains part of the discourse in Russia, and it's actually a euphemism for replacing the Ukrainian government. Right? So the argument is you have Nazis in power. They're also American puppets, which is a little complicated ideologically, but it works apparently on Russian TV. And what this means to denazify Ukraine means Zelensky is out and you install someone like the earlier president Yanukovych, which Moscow can control with a mixture of carrots and sticks. That's what denazify Ukraine means, which is why it was all the more shocking when Robert Kennedy Jr. yesterday said that one of the points of the war in Ukraine is that Russia needs to denazify Ukraine. And the last argument is that Ukraine isn't even a country. Like, they're not invading anything different because Ukraine is part of Russia. Right? The Bolsheviks accidentally, with the stroke of a pen, created a country that didn't exist. And if it doesn't exist and it's just part of Russia, what's the big deal? And this argument, right, which seems so spurious, does have local currency or does have popular currency, to the point where I saw an interview last year with a female member of parliament in Russia, and she was saying, how were we supposed to know that invading Ukraine was going to be perceived by the West as if we were invading France? It's not even a different country. It's not France. It's like invading Rostov, one of the Russian regions. All right, so there's this understanding that once Ukraine was part of the Russian Empire and part of the Soviet Union, and therefore it belongs to Russia forever, and it can just take it back whenever it wants. Now, this has created a little bit of friction with some of the Central Asian countries, which were also once part of the Soviet Union. And there's some great memes from the Mongolians who said, oh, well, look at where we were in charge before. Like, maybe we'll reclaim our lands too. In any case, there are all of these arguments. If you track how the narratives are used on Russian television, you can see that they ebb and flow depending on what's happening. But they're effective enough that surveys about the Crocus City terrorist attack that happened a couple weeks ago in Russia, 75% of those surveyed believe that it was Ukraine that was behind the Crocus City attacks. And even though ISIS keeps trying to take credit, the Russians will not let them do that. For Putin, this is not just about Ukraine now. It started out as being about Ukraine, but now it's about world peace. Right? Mir, here, this Russian word says a fight for peace or a fight for the world. Mir is the same word. And this is Dmitry Kiselyov. It's like the Russian 60 Minutes, very popular TV show. And here there's an interview with Putin that he's explaining that the fight in Ukraine is now a war between Russia and the United States, between Russia and the US. And what he's really saying here, which is actually true, is that what we are looking is at a fight for who is going to control the global world order. This liberal international order that has prevailed since the end of World War II, and especially through the Cold War, is basically over. The United States, very messy, very ugly withdrawal from Afghanistan, the fact that Iraq is a mess, what's happening now in Gaza, all of these factors contribute to the impression of many countries, maybe not Europe and the United States, but many other countries, that in fact, like the institutions that were established after World War II are no longer capable of managing the world order. And therefore, we need to move to something that's multipolar, that's the Chinese and the Russian expression, and allows other countries to play a bigger role and possibly control what's happening more effectively than the United Nations and the World Trade Organization and the others that have let these catastrophes happen. All right, that's the uplifting middle part of the talk. So what have we done? Well, we've sent a lot of military equipment, and by we, I mean the United States. The United States is the main supplier of military equipment to Ukraine, much more than the Europeans, who've done their part, but who naturally have much smaller reserves than the United States. The Europeans have provided a lot of humanitarian assistance, a lot of financial assistance, which includes, for example, cash to pay salaries of Ukrainian public servants who otherwise would not get paid. But military assistance has basically been the responsibility of the US, which is why the fact that Congress won't pass the $60 billion aid package is having such a serious impact on the fighting fields of Ukraine. But apart from the assistance, we've also sanctioned Russia. Russia has tons of sanctions, more sanctions than any other country. And these have taken several different forms. So there's sanctions on logistics and trade. The particularly effective ones were on avionics, semiconductors, and oil. And I'll talk about oil in a minute. Financial sanctions, kicking Russia out of SWIFT, and even more importantly, not letting Russian banks use correspondent banks in New York. So 80% of the global economy is going through correspondent banks, either in Europe or in the United States. Even if there's let's say a German company that's buying something in Japan, very often the transaction is going through correspondent banks in New York in the dollar because that's the common currency. So once you kick Russian banks out of correspondent banks, it gets much more difficult to make transactions with any part of the world. And even though there's been an attempt to shift to rupee settlements and yuan settlements and all of this, it hasn't gone as well as working with SWIFT and the dollar. There have also been individual sanctions, the yachts, et cetera, not very effective, but they're the feel-good moment. And then self-sanctioning the corporate companies that have left, and it's not all of them, rather surprisingly. And then the brain drain, the million or so people that have left Russia, often highly educated and disproportionately representing the IT and the digital sectors. So all of these sanctions were supposed to essentially shut down the Russian economy, make things so bad that either the population was going to take to the streets and protest and say, Putin, this is so terrible, you have to stop the war, or the inner circle of oligarchs who were making so much money with their connections to the other part of the world were going to say, Putin, this wasn't the deal. We're supporting you because you let us have all of this money, all of these rents, and these nice houses on Lake Como. That, however, is not what happened. Why not? Well, the sanctions did bite in certain sectors. So, for example, car manufacturing, which was really car assembling by Western companies, dropped like a stone, and Chinese imports increased. So China went from having 9% of the Russian vehicle market to 30% in 2022. That was a pretty effective sanction. And then some big stores like IKEA closed. That was a little sad. But mostly, things were not so bad, because if we look at the daily revenues that Russia earns from selling hydrocarbons, oil and gas products, you can see that even in the bad days of last summer, they were still earning over 500 million euros a day in the sale of oil and gas. 500 million euros a day. The estimate is that the war cost them about $300 million a day, which is incidentally how much we spent on Afghanistan every day for 20 years. But you're able to manage those costs if you're getting a steady flow of revenue. And there were efforts to control this revenue. But very importantly, the efforts were focused not on reducing the supply of Russian oil and gas on the market, because nobody wants gas prices to go up anywhere. And so the idea was that they need to try and impact the amount of money that Russia earns without getting them to stop producing oil and gas. The 11 billion barrels that Russia produces every day of crude oil is 12% of the global market. And if you remove that from the global market, there's no other place to get it from at the same price. The prices would go up, and that's bad for all of those Western politicians that are trying to support Ukraine. So there's this complicated oil cap, which was working for a while until Russia figured out a way to go around it. And the bottom line is that even now, the Europeans have done an amazing job of reducing their dependence on natural gas imports, pipeline imports from Russia. They're still making plenty of money. They're selling to the Chinese, to Turkey, to India. They're selling their oil and gas. They're also selling nuclear exports. Did you know that 20% of the United States uranium is coming from Russia still? It is. And in part, it's because Russian uranium was always cheaper than other sources of uranium. So other parts of the world, including all of those French power plants and American power plants, rely on Russian nuclear exports. And those have been booming because now Russia is going to different countries, particularly in developing economies, and saying, look, we'll build you a nuclear reactor. We can do it for much cheaper than Westinghouse. And then afterwards, it's like the razor blade model. You just buy our uranium every year for the next 30 years. That's difficult to resist for a country with budget constraints. The other thing that Russia is effectively exporting is security services. So the Wagner Group, this was their charming logo, right? The Wagner Group doesn't exist anymore, but all of those mercenaries that were working for them still do. And they're still working to prop up juntas all across Africa and provide security service, which has also meant that Russia is able to actually extend and improve its ties with African countries, partially by providing some of these security services, and then also by providing and trying to take over the Ukrainian grain markets that have been constrained ever since the Russians made shipping through the Black Sea so complicated. So Russia still has things to export, but it also is managing to import things. This is not IKEA, which we know closed. This is Schwedhaus, the Russian knockoff version of IKEA. And everywhere in Moscow, those fancy stores that closed are now reopened under new management, as it were, because they were given to new oligarchs in order to buy their loyalty. And Russians, especially in the big cities, which everybody wants to keep quiet, everybody in the Kremlin, are able to go about pretty much their daily lives without too much suffering or even thinking about the war. In fact, this is not what Moscow looks like. This was Moscow in 1992. Moscow is a place where you can still get a Barbie cappuccino if you want. Okay? Life is pretty good in Moscow. The restaurants are packed. How is that possible? Well, one of the reasons is that Xi Jinping and China have given Russia a lifeline. And this lifeline has taken several forms. One is the political lifeline. China has never come out against Russia to condemn this aggression. And even though it seems, from reading the tea leaves, as it were, that Putin promised Xi Jinping that, first of all, this wasn't going to happen before the Beijing Olympics were over. And second of all, that it was going to be quick, like 3 or 4 days, and the war would be over. So it's been a lot messier than Putin promised. But also, Xi Jinping appreciates that, in a way, Ukraine is the fuel that's burning up the United States and Russian capabilities while China buys more time in order to recover from COVID, in order to build up its military-industrial complex, increase its supply of nuclear weapons, of missiles, and everything else. So it's very advantageous to both sides. However, right before the war started, these two leaders declared that they had a no-limits partnership. Right? And this was parsed by many as being an alliance, right? But it's not an alliance. And in fact, the Chinese have been very adamant to come out and say it's not an alliance. An alliance would mean that China would defend Russia. And China does not plan on defending Russia. Moreover, we know from leaked papers a couple months ago that when Russia is doing new war games now, they're training on the idea of a Chinese invasion. So while Putin has become dependent on Xi Jinping, this is not a love affair. I mean, they have seen each other 40 times, which is a lot for two leaders, but Putin has become very dependent on Xi Jinping. And it's not just politically, it's also economically. So you might say, well, China is always increasing its exports everywhere, so of course they're increasing them to Russia. But that's not exactly true, right? If we look at Chinese global exports in 2023, right, the economy did go down, but the exports to advanced economies, the blue line, is going up pretty slowly compared to exports to Russia and Central Asia, which is the red line. And what this means is two things. First of all, China is increasing exports to Russia directly. And second of all, China is increasing exports to countries like Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, Armenia, Georgia, and then those countries are forwarding those exports into Russia, so-called parallel imports. And the result is that even though we have this huge raft of sanctions on all of these different economic sectors, most of the equipment that the Russians need, at least in the military-industrial complex, they're now able to get directly or indirectly through China or parallel imports, including, it appears, microchips and things like that they're putting in drones and that the Ukrainians then find when they go through the debris. China is not going to do everything for Russia, though. And for me, the best indicator of that is the power of Siberia pipeline. So one of the things that you may know about Russian natural gas exports is that there is a huge pipeline infrastructure that goes from Siberia into Western Europe. This was built starting in the 1950s. And the fact is, it's very easy to export from a gas field to, let's say, a German company if you have a pipeline that connects it. You put the gas molecule in one end and it comes out on the other end. Almost no cost. Once you have to start liquefying natural gas, you need to liquefy it at a port. You need to then put it on a special tanker. Then you need a regasification station on the other end. And then you need to ship it to wherever it has to go. It's a much more clumsy process. So partially to tie Russia into the global economy, the Europeans invested in this energy infrastructure and these pipelines. And partially also to increase the dependence of Western Europe on Russia, Russia was happy to build these pipelines. It was a very good way for it to sell its natural gas. However, when the annexation of Crimea happened in 2014, things started to look a little different. And Putin wanted to show Europe that he had alternatives. Like, he didn't have to send his gas to Europe, even though all the pipelines practically went there. And so they built this Power of Siberia pipeline. It's pretty small, though. There's no way that it replaces the amount of gas that was going to Europe. And the Chinese were very tough negotiators on the price. When the prices are agreed on this kind of pipeline, they're 20 or 30-year contracts. They're very extensive, and the Chinese had been negotiating for 10 years to get the Russians to bring down their price. And the Russians were saying, hey, we could go sell it to France, okay? We don't need to sell it to you guys. So we're not going to agree to your terms. But after 2014, when Europe makes a little bit of noise over the annexation of Crimea, the first thing Putin does is fly to Beijing and sign a contract on China's terms so that he could then tell Europe, you see, I do have another place where I can sell my natural gas. We don't even know now the terms of this arrangement because we assume that they're so disadvantageous for Russia. But it worked. They do have a place now to sell their piped gas, but because the diameter of the pipe is so small, they wanted to build a second one, the Power of Siberia 2, which runs parallel to Power of Siberia 1. But the Chinese refused to agree to the price. So every time Putin and Xi Jinping meet, Putin announces, and his press service believes, that they're going to sign this agreement, and Putin will be able to say, you see, we're able to send our gas elsewhere, and the Chinese refuse to sign it. And for me, that is the strongest indicator that the Chinese are perfectly happy to use Russia as a source of cheap commodities. Like, it's very convenient for them to have that. But there is no super deep friendship here. Right? There are common short-term interests. Many of them are economic. Many of them are also industrial. I don't know if you saw yesterday, there was a report that there's increased transactions in propellants and optical technology, for example. So it's a marriage of convenience. But I think people who say that's it, like now we've got a new axis of opposition, I think they're overstating the extent to which China and Russia trust each other, which I believe is not very much. There are other countries, though, that are helping Russia, including, for example, the Caucasus, Georgia and Armenia. The border between Georgia and Russia is populated with a lot of trucks that are waiting to go into Russia. And if you look at here, these are Georgian exports to Russia and Central Asia and Armenian exports. And this is what happens after the invasion. Right? Those are the parallel imports. And that's why the Georgian and the Armenian economies are growing by 10 or 12% as opposed to struggling as they were before. And why don't we crack down on them? Why don't we impose secondary sanctions? Well, the fact is, on some level, we're still trying to woo these countries away from Russia and into the Western orbit. And if you start cracking down on economic growth, it's a much more difficult case to make. So there has been, let's say, not a blind eye, but one eye turned away from the fact that this is happening. And it looks like the United States is trying to crack down on it country by country. So Uzbekistan has pulled back a little bit. Kyrgyzstan has pulled back a little bit. But the bottom line is that Russia is still able to get most of what it wants from the rest of the world. So the big question is, how does this war end? The war termination literature talks about 4 scenarios for the end of conflicts like this. The first is total victory. So that means that either Putin manages to completely control Ukraine, which is his objective, right? Maybe he doesn't send troops all the way to the Polish border, but he manages to get control over the government in Kiev. Seems pretty unlikely. For Ukraine, total victory would mean they push the Russians out of all of the occupied territories, including Crimea. That also doesn't seem very likely. However, neither side has changed its goals, its objectives. And in fact, in conflict, countries don't just change their goals because they have a change of heart. They change their goals as a result of information they get on the battlefield that persuades them that they do not have the capacity to achieve their goals. And Russia believes it does have the capacity to achieve its goal, in part because it believes that democracies are weaker than autocracies, and that ultimately the West is fickle and will get tired of this war like we did in Iraq and Afghanistan and pull out, and then they'll be able to move forward. Putin is convinced the time is on his side. The Ukrainians believe that if they had the kind of military equipment that they have been asking for, that they would be able to push the Russians out. Now, I suspect that they're asking some very difficult questions now because the West turns out to be an inconsistent supplier. So we promised eventually F-16s. They're getting 6 in the next few months. That is not enough to make a difference. And a military officer recently said, yeah, we needed F-16s last summer. Now what we need are munitions and shells. And even that, the West has trouble providing. Not because we don't have them, but because we cannot pass this aid deal in Congress because Mike Johnson won't bring it to the floor. If it's brought to the floor, it will pass. But he is not bringing it to the floor because Donald Trump does not want Ukraine to be able to fight with Russia, for reasons we don't completely understand, but suspect the worst. So total victory, let's say, not possible, at least in the foreseeable future. The second possible outcome is a ceasefire. So this is a situation where both sides stop fighting, stop shooting. It's not exactly a frozen conflict because it remains very hot. And if we look at ceasefires in the region, like between Armenia and Azerbaijan over Nagorno-Karabakh, they're pretty unstable. Right? The ceasefire allows the stronger party to rearm, regroup, rest its soldiers, and then attack again. And so a ceasefire is most definitely not in the interests of the Ukrainians at this point. The third possibility is an armistice. And the most famous armistice is, of course, what we have in Korea. This is the DMZ between North and South Korea. And this is a very interesting case. I actually just covered it in my class. I'm teaching a class on the war. And we covered what an armistice might look like on Thursday. So an armistice is a type of ceasefire, but it's an agreement where you put away all a talk of resolving the political questions, meaning who owns that territory, who owns those occupied territories. That is such a big, thorny question to which both sides will not agree that you say, okay, let's not talk about that. Let's think about how we can at least stop the war. But the important thing, to my mind, is that it took 2 years to negotiate the armistice in Korea, 575 meetings. And during that time, the fighting had never been as intense as it was, because the Americans understood that the only way that the Chinese and the Soviet Union were going to convince North Korea to stop fighting and stop providing the resources is if they were absolutely sure that they were not going to advance beyond the line of the 38th parallel. And so if we believe that an armistice is possible, on some level, some kind of conversations have to start happening, even though they might look like they did initially in the war, where you have an American general and a North Korean general, and the North Korean general is smoking and saying nothing for 2 hours. Okay? That's how these things start. But in order for Ukraine to get a good deal, it needs 2 things. First, it needs intensified supply of weaponry so that Russia knows that it can continue fighting and will continue fighting if they don't come to the table. And second of all, they need some kind of security guarantee, a convincing to Russia security guarantee that if Russia violates the agreement, that there will be a response, not only from Ukraine. Right? Russia is not afraid of the Ukrainian response at this point. The only effective response is either an American response or a NATO response, because anything short of that, Russia will not respect. And we actually know this for a fact, right? There was a memorandum signed when Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons, where the West provided security assurances, not guarantees, that if the sovereignty of Ukraine was violated, Europe would come to its assistance in the United States. Like, that obviously did not happen in 2014 or in 2022. There are precedents, though, for the United States providing something short of what Article 5, NATO's Article 5, would include. And the one that's most often referred to is the agreement between the Memorandum of Understanding between the United States and Israel in 1975, which was the Israeli requirement for signing a peace agreement with Egypt. And that agreement, that Memorandum of Understanding, says that United States will look with special gravity upon any breaking of the ceasefire. Now, I don't think special gravity is going to work anymore, right? Not only because of what's happened in the Middle East, but also because Ukraine has been burned before by accepting milquetoast Western guarantees. So we may not want to include Ukraine in NATO because Article 5 implies that an attack against one is an attack against all, although contested territories have been included in countries that accede into NATO. And the example there is West Germany and East Germany. But short of Article 5, the United States and or NATO could still provide effective security guarantees that would convince the Russians that they cannot retake that territory. And importantly, those conditions also say that if Ukraine were to violate the agreement, that the security guarantees don't hold, right? So that in a way is the carrot that's offered to the Russians, is they're not allowed to violate it and the Ukrainians aren't allowed to violate it. The chances of this working are pretty slim. But at the same time, not trying means that in 2 years, let's say 575 non-meetings later, we're in exactly the same place as we are now. And in the meantime, Ukraine is being trashed, for lack of a better word, both in terms of what's happening to the people and what's happening to the infrastructure. Now, there are a couple of potentially mitigating factors here. One is the relationship between China and Russia. If for some reason China decides that it's in its interest to cut Russia loose, perhaps because of greater economic ties, then if it pulls away from Russia, or it tells Russia that now it has to come to the table, or God forbid, if Russia uses nuclear weapons, which China has said is a deal breaker, then it's possible that this support, this kind of, I can only think of the Russian word, the sort of backstop that China is providing for Russia, if that's not there, it's possible that the Russians will have to retreat. The second factor is fatigue on both sides, particularly on the Ukrainian side. People have been at the front now for over 2 years. The country is exhausted. Even when I was there last summer, people were saying that they were exhausted. And even though they're ready to keep fighting, it's unclear that they can continue fighting year after year. And the thing we have to remember is there's a study by Uppsala University that finds that if you look at all of the conflicts between 1946 and the present, about a quarter of them end in less than a week. Another quarter end in less than a month, but the half that continue for at least a year continue for decades. And that is probably what we're looking at here. The 2024 presidential election is a particularly dangerous moment, particularly if Trump comes, not only because Ukraine has a weird relationship with Trump, given the impeachment hearing, but also because Trump threatens to undermine NATO and undermine NATO's deterrence. So he has told Putin, or he has said, that if countries don't pay the 2% into the NATO budget, which, by the way, is not to the United States, it's to the NATO budget, that he'll let Putin do whatever he wants to those countries. Okay, that's insane to say that, if only because NATO operates on the principle of deterrence. And if you basically tell Putin, hey, call the bluff, we're not going to help the NATO allies if you invade them, then basically NATO is worth nothing. So we don't know what a President Trump would say and how dangerous that would be for NATO. And even though NATO is celebrating its 75th birthday anniversary right now, as we speak, and trying to basically become Trump-proof and able to sustain an alliance without firm American support, they're really not going to be able to do that. They don't have the military capacity to be able to replace the United States in supplying Ukraine. They don't have the capacity to provide the same kind of deterrence as the United States provides, if only because the number of nuclear weapons, let's say, that France has is insignificant compared to how much the US has. And then the last mitigating factor is potentially the war in Gaza and what happens there. If the war in the Middle East expands and even more focus moves away from what's happening in Europe to what's happening in the Middle East, it's going to be more and more difficult to sustain the kind of support that Ukraine would need to keep fighting. And that, to my mind, is a big question mark. So unfortunately, the most likely outcome is protracted conflict. And this means, for example, this was Kharkiv a couple days ago, that Russia will continue doing things like striking schools, hospitals, energy infrastructure. Now they have a new technique favored by terrorists everywhere, which is the double tap technique. You launch a missile into a building, you wait until the first responders come, and then you launch another one to kill the first responders, right? And this is what has happened yesterday. So let me stop there and open it to questions. Yes, thank you.
So I graduated from the Soviet Union program in 1969. So, but I never really pursued much with respect to working in that field. I'm an environmental consultant now. But my question is, there's a lot of conscription going on right now. All right. Is there a division in the population there with respect to age? Are the younger people?
Are you talking about Russia or Ukraine?
Russia. In terms of the popularity of Putin going from 60 before the war to 80 and then 87% voting. But the 80% is more significant. The 87% is who's running against him.
Right.
So is there a division in the country? I know Navalny and so forth, but is there an age division with respect to support? Because this 80% support, that means the Russians really resent what happened under Gorbachev, okay? And all of these republics, or whatever they were called, now independent countries, is that really hurt the Russian economy, what happened under Gorbachev? Why are the Russians so adamant about supporting a war like this against the Ukraine?
Okay, that's a lot of questions rolled together, so let me try and break them apart. First, the effect of the dissolution of the Soviet Union. There was an incredibly tough hit on the Russian economy and on the standard of living in Russia. It was far worse than the Great Depression in the United States. Now, that doesn't mean that everybody suffered, right? Obviously, the oligarchs did very well, and there were a lot of young people who finally had the opportunity to start new businesses, to go abroad, to get a Western education, and they took advantage of that. But the 90s were very difficult for a lot of people. I don't think that most people who came out of that their conclusion was, gosh, like we need to do everything we can to pull the Soviet Union back together. Because there was an understanding that that wasn't possible. Russia did not have the capacity to hold those countries. A lot of people say that it would have agreed with Putin, that it was a great geopolitical catastrophe, right? And it's hard to go from being a great power to being a not so great power, right? Nobody likes that. But it is true that the older population, particularly the population that relies on television for its news, which is kind of above 60 years old, let's say, that they tend to be more susceptible to the party line that's coming out of the Kremlin than the younger population. Now, I don't want to say that the difference is exclusively in the type of media that's consumed, because even in many social media channels, the young Russians are not necessarily getting BBC on Telegram. They could, but they're not. What they're getting are social media channels that are essentially repackaging the Kremlin propaganda campaign and distributing it through social media. But they appear to be more skeptical. So if we look at that poll that I mentioned of the 75% who believe that the Ukrainians were responsible for the Crocus City attack, young people tend to be more skeptical of that than older people. So the question is, how much of the population actually supports Putin? Like, I'm willing to put money on the fact that it's not 87%, right? That I feel comfortable saying. Although, as you point out, there's no opponent, so it's not like they could have voted for someone else. The only thing they could do was deface their ballot. But what our guess is, and it's just an educated guess, is that you have maybe 20% of the population deeply believes in this war, that it's a good idea. And they might believe for ideological reasons, like Ukraine is not a country, or they might believe for economic reasons. All of those poor soldiers from Buryatia and the non-Russian ethnic republics that are disproportionately drafted to go into the army and then get enormous salaries, more than they've ever earned in their life. In many of those villages, people have never had it so good as they do now. The war has changed their life for the better. And so you could see why, even if they're kind of ambivalent about Ukrainians, the war has been good for them. Then you have maybe 10 or 15% of the Russian population that's still in Russia, that's very much against the war, but feels incapable of doing anything about it. Either they protested and they spent a little time in jail and realized that the repressive engine of the country was going to crack down on them, so they decided not to do it. Or they think that they have no power. And in this respect, they're similar to the whole rest of the population, which has been very methodically demobilized over the course of 24 years under Putin. Right? The Putin regime has tried to make people feel like politics doesn't matter. There's nothing you can do about it. Who cares who's running the country? Like everything stays the same for you. All you have to do is concentrate on your individual life and having your job and getting your benefits. And then like things are okay. Don't worry about things that don't concern you. Right? And I think there's a degree of apathy that comes from living in what's now a dictatorship, right? That's difficult for us to understand in the West. That being said, I always like to remind people that during the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, I think very few Americans woke up every day and said, oh my God, I can't believe this terrible thing that's happening, in part because of American soldiers. So we shouldn't overestimate the extent to which the average person in the average country that's fighting somewhere is going to be mobilized or personally affected by the conflict. I tried that line out on a Russian friend of mine who was visiting, and she goes, yeah, okay, I see your point, but like, what if you were invading Canada? Like, what if you invaded a country that basically you had a lot of common ties with? Don't you think people would be a little more agitated than the Russians are? And I think she has a point, right? What's shocking about the apathy is that most people have Ukrainian family members. They spend time in Ukraine. They like Ukraine. Right? And so for them to accept that this conflict is happening and that these terrible things are happening, like either you have to completely turn off your sort of reality filter, which I don't think Russians are doing, or you have to say, yes, it's not so good, but there's nothing I can do about it. And so I might as well just, go about my daily life and make sure my kids have as good a life as possible. Yes?
Very good presentation. To the horror of almost everybody in this room, and in fact, everybody in the zip code, it's possible that Trump will win in November. And if that horrible prospect happens, what do you think of those four options that you gave us? Mm-hmm. Total victory for one side or another, armistice, or prolonged, I forgot the...
Prolonged, here, I can go back.
Yeah, or prolonged war. Here we go.
Yeah.
Ceasefire, armistice, protracted conflict. It may not matter who is elected here, but in your opinion, if Trump wins, are either of those four more likely?
I don't think total victory is more likely, right? In part because total victory is not just, let's say, the Russians advancing, but it's that the Ukrainians would stop fighting. Right? And I think there is no way that the Ukrainians are going to stop fighting. Even if the Russians managed to control Kiev somehow, they would still be facing partisan warfare, for decades, as they did, by the way, between 1920, when the Bolsheviks took over the country, and 1950, when they finally ended up putting down the partisans in the West. So I don't think total victory is more likely. I also don't think a ceasefire is more likely, because you couldn't get the Ukrainians to agree to it. Protracted conflict at that point depends on how long the Ukrainians can keep fighting with the kind of equipment that they've had. My guess is that, Europe will find enough workarounds to American intransigence to allow the Ukrainians to keep fighting. And that's not at the same levels that they were in 2022 or even 2023, but about where they are now. So, for example, the Czechs are buying American shells and sending them to Ukraine. We also know that because of the Korean armistice, both North Korea and South Korea have enormous stockpiles of armaments. North Korea has been supplying Russia, and South Korea has been supplying Ukraine. We don't know how much they've used of their stocks, but we suspect that they still have a lot more that they could use. The irony, of course, is that that aid that goes to Ukraine, it's not like it's bags of cash leaving the country, right? Most of it is going to American factories that are producing these equipment. And so the money is staying in the United States, and in fact, going to factories that are in some of the constituencies of the Republicans who refuse to pass the aid package. Right? So I think protracted conflict is still the most likely because I don't see, given Trump's diplomatic non-prowess, I don't see how he can help to nurture the kind of negotiations that would have to underpin an armistice. Yes?
Thank you. Excellent presentation. I had a question on I think you said the cost of the war was $300 million a day from the export revenue. And then the military budget I heard is a few $100 billion, over $500 billion. How does, and of course the conscription that they have, right, for Russian men, how does that kind of, learning long term, how does it increase the domestic opposition to Putin at some point? Does the domestic, opposition get strong, or there's another faction which topples Putin? Is that a potential one of the outcomes out of this war?
So I'm pretty pessimistic on democratization in Russia, in part because, the main opposition leader was Navalny, right, who's now out of the picture. No one has emerged even close to him in terms of being a natural political leader with charisma, with the sense of how you build infrastructure to win political contestation and things like that. And anyway, there are no real elections at a significant level. The other thing is that even if you look at what the opposition abroad is saying, right, there are all of these conferences where they're drafting new constitutions and they're thinking about what they're going to do. Like, they all imagine that after Putin, everyone comes out on the streets and says, yes, let's form these wonderful political parties that are now going to compete against each other. And we're going to have a free press, which we haven't had in 20 years. And all of a sudden we'll be like Europe. But I don't understand how you get from where you are now to that, right? There's some kind of very ugly process in the middle. You don't have democratic elections without political parties. And you don't have political parties without the sense of politicians, right? And you don't have politicians in Russia right now because people are not accountable to their constituencies. So even if Putin was no longer in the picture, right, I believe the most likely outcome is someone from his inner circle, at least kind of in that first period, who are probably too busy fighting for power to do a big policy change like end the war. But you wouldn't have an alternative leader, someone with a different point of view, until probably after that person. So hoping that the war ends because Putin dies or because he gets replaced one way or another, or there's some kind of massive demonstration on the street. We've missed massive demonstrations in Russia before, like 1917, but I don't think it's very likely. I don't think that's how the war ends. That being said, one of the interesting things about the Korean example, the Korean armistice, is that the real breakthrough after 2 years was when Stalin died and the Soviet position softened, right? So you could have progress on the Ukrainian front if Putin were no longer in the picture. But I think that there's such a small probability of all of those things going right to produce real democratic or real opposition. Let's not even call it democratic opposition. That I don't think that's a likely outcome.
We have time for one more question.
Oh, I think it's a woman's turn.
Alexandra, I cover this conflict as a journalist. And so I just want to say that was an amazing presentation, the way you made it so clear and understandable. There's so much about this war that was a surprise. And one of the, I think, pleasant surprises is seeing how Mikhail Zelensky brought his country together. So I'd really like to hear what you think about him and about how everything looks to him right now, 2 years into the war.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Zelensky is amazing, right? And I should say he was not amazing before the war, right? He had very low popularity ratings. He was having real trouble reforming some of the corrupt institutions in Ukraine. There was not a consensus on joining NATO before the war started. There was not a consensus on going through the very difficult reforms that were going to happen. I mean, that being said, since 2014, there's definitely been a surge in popularity for joining Europe, for joining NATO, for being part of the European community. But to join the EU, right, you have 32 or 33 clusters of reforms that have to happen. It's a very long, very difficult process. And it's unclear that Zelensky would have had the ability and the support to be able to do that. The war starts. And all of a sudden, the fact that he's a comedian and a charismatic performer and understands social media and the importance of communication is almost all that matters, right? He does not leave when Kiev is surrounded, right? And he does these daily videos, basically convincing the Ukrainian people that they're fighting the right fight, that yes, they are suffering. Yes, it is difficult, but they're in it for the right reasons. And they all believe in a free and independent Ukraine. And so he has been able to hold people together and give them the support that they need to be unbelievably resilient. Of course, that makes us all nervous. Like, what if something happened to Zelensky? Like, what would happen? And I have to say, I was a lot more nervous about this before the conflict with Zaluzhny came out. Right? So Zaluzhny was the commander-in-chief of the armed forces. They were supposedly, Zaluzhny was popular, maybe more popular than Zelensky, and then he was replaced and sent to be the ambassador in London. But the fact that there's one other popular person in Ukraine lets me sleep better, right? Because it means even if something happened to Zelensky, there's someone else that has some kind of basis for stepping into those shoes potentially and being able to keep the fight going. So he has been incredibly important. I mean, he is the true wartime leader that Ukraine needed. But I don't think he's irreplaceable, which is a good thing.
Well, thank you, Dr. Vacroux,
You're
for
welcome.
helping
I can come down.
better understand
Thank you, Bonnie.
this multifaceted, multi-layered, complex situation around Ukraine and its sobering ramifications.
Thank you.
So on behalf of Harvard
Thank you.
GSAS,
Thank
Harvard
you.
Griffin GSAS, we'd like to give you a small token of appreciation for sharing your expertise.
Thank you. And thank you for the great questions.